and welcome. You're listening to Lore and Legend with your hosts Sebastian, Odell and Rick Scott. Every week we bring you a legendary tale inspired by the rich traditions of world folklore and mythology. This series of Lore and Legend is called Strange Britannia, exploring dark and lesser-known tales of the British otherworld and its hidden beings. In this first episode, we begin our journey into the Shadowlands with a firelit feast, a witch's harp, and a poet with a tongue full of secrets he can't help but tell. This is the Rhymer's Tale.
Now I'll tell you a tale of a Britain that is almost gone. A Britain of stone circles and barrow hills, of giants' graves and fairy rings. The Britain of the Beltane fires, the greenwood, the enchanted isle. The Britain of the She, the Fae, the hidden people, the woodkind, the fair folk, the story folk, the lordly ones, the people of the barrows, of Grimms, of boggarts, bogles and imps, of goblins and pucks and dwarfs and brownies and bugbears, the elfkin and the earl king. It was a night like every other night, but at the same time not like them, and bonfires were lit on the plains beneath the dark skies of Scotland, and the flames of the fires threw dancing shadows across the canvas of 100 tents, and there, rising up in their midst, was the tower of Ercildown, and all around the music and the laughter ran in circles through the camp, into the courtyard, and into the hall. And there a hush descended, as into the feasting circle stepped a figure. He held in his hands a harp, and it was exquisitely carved, and it was strung with strings that seemed to be spun from gold and from silver. And when the man's fingers flowed across these chords, everyone who heard woke up from whatever they were doing, and they turned their ears to listen. For this was the one that they called Thomas, True Thomas, once Thomas Learmount, a poor lute player now courted by the great and the powerful for the gifts of his tongue. For the words that he spoke, they had the habit of being spoken from ear to ear, and written down in parchments, in poems and in books, and repeated often and many times thereafter, and always, eventually, those words came to be true. Well, I was at the feast of Ercildown Tower when True Thomas was rhyming there, and as I heard told, he got his gift from the Queen of Elfland fair. A great silence fell on all the company, and everyone sat breathlessly waiting for him to begin. This harp, he said, is not just any harp, but the notes that it plays have the power to weave deep magic. It is a harp crafted by no human hand, but it came from a great sorceress, an enchantress. It came from the hands of the most beautiful lady that I have ever seen. It came from the Queen of the Elfinland. Listen, lords, both great and small, and take heed of what I say, for I shall tell you as true a tale as was ever heard by night or day. And as he spoke, Thomas strummed the strings, and he began to rhyme, and he began to sing. As I made my way one fateful morn, my mind was full of longing and of woe. And it was a merry morn of May, I went to Huntly Bank alone. Now at those times, he told us, Thomas was not true Thomas, but merely Thomas of Learmount, a vagabond of little means, of no employment, whose habit on a morning often was to drink and to stray about the paths by the Eildon hills, carrying only a poor lute and serenading all the men and the women who happened to pass him by. I wandered in the company of birds, the jay, the cock and thrush, and with the chiming of their voices the wood all about was flush. Now Thomas told that as he was there, surrounded by the bright bird song and the sun shining in the sky, he threaded his way through the paths that crisscrossed between the trees. And then he lowered himself onto the fair grass, listened to the mingled calls and whispers of the wood, and beneath the swaying canopy of the tree, he closed his eyes for a long time. But when at last he did open them, alone there for some time I lay beneath a greenwood tree, when I did spy a lady gay come riding over the long glee. And if I should live until doomsday, and in that time tell 1,000 tales, I never could tell of another who struck me like this maid. And the woman was of deeply striking beauty. Her proud lips were curved like an archer's bow bent and about to fly. Her braided hair rested on strong, proud shoulders, and her eyes were deep and bright like scrying stones. She was seated high upon a gleaming white horse, draped with a crimson veil, and around its knees bobbed the heads of 6 glowering hounds. This living vision was framed all in the light that broke through the crown of the great elder tree that crouched on the crown of the nearby hill. Her skirt was of the grass-green silk, her mantle of the velvet fine. At every lock of a horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. I said, if I never speak with that lady, my heart will burst in 3. So I ran forth with all my might to meet her at the Eildon tree. At Thomas's approach, the hounds that clustered around her startled and fled away barking, leaving the lady quite alone upon a horse. She turned her head as Thomas ran breathlessly up to her, and she glanced at the poor lute which he held in his hands. And so I doffed my hat and got down upon my knee, and cried, All hail, thou mighty Queen of Heaven, for thy peer on earth I never did see. Oh no, Thomas, she said, give no such name as that to me. I am but the queen of a strange land, come out a-hunting, as you can see. Ah, lady, Thomas had said, won't you come and lie here a while beneath the tree with me? The lady smiled, a smile as if to sigh, and when she met his eye, it was as if the gaze pierced him. And then the lady did a strange thing. She undid the bridle of her horse and cast it over a thorn brush by the side. And she asked Thomas to play a tune upon his lute. And so she listened as Thomas played. And Thomas, staring up at her, felt quite faint. His hands moved feverishly over the strings, until at last the tune faltered and it died away. He wet his lips and he spoke to the lady again. Lie with me here, beneath the tree, my lady, he said, and ever I will with thee dwell, and plight my troth to thee. And then the lady smiled, and in that smile there was something of the wolf. "Harp and carp, Thomas," she said, "harp and carp along with me. For if thee dare to kiss my lips, sure of your body I will be." But I said, "Betide me weal, betide me woe, that is no dissuading me." So then I kissed her rosy lips all beneath the Eildon tree. And when Thomas's lips met the lady's, there was a rich fragrance of blossom and the taste of elderflowers. And when Thomas leaned back, the Queen's smile was even wider and more wolfish than before. "Since you my lips have kissed, Thomas, away you must come with me, and you must serve me 7 years, what weal or woe may be." Then the Elf Queen turned and she took up her horse's bridle. She leapt up into the saddle. She spurred the animal, and the ringing of the bells on the bridle rolled and seemed to kick up the very wind itself. She galloped away, and as she did so the great roots of the Eildon tree yawned wide to admit her into the hillside. As soon as she went, Thomas felt a dreadful lurch in his chest. He clutched at it, instantly stricken. It was as if his heart was tethered to that horse by some invisible thread, and as it rode away from him, something deep in the seams of him was being unravelled. With a cry he stumbled forward, fell to his knees, scrambled up and plunged into the dark and the mist of the tunnel without more thought, for he knew that if he did not follow the Queen he would be left nothing more than a revenant, a spark of soul in a body of clay. He ran headlong into the space beneath the tree, a thick tunnel of mist that uncurled to swallow him. The air was hot and moist on his skin, like the touch of heavy breathing, and the landscape around him was filled with strange shadows, dim forms. "Sure as I tell it," Thomas said, "when you travel the length and breadth of our fair country, you will see many strange and peculiar things. Stones standing towards the sun, wells dug deep toward the earth, hollow hills and claw-marked caves, and they appear to be all but ruins, with something forgotten and unexplained. But I say, that which shows itself a ruin in the day shows its true self inside the mists, and the standing stones are towers, and the hollow hills are palaces, and the wells are great lakes, and the caves the mouths of wide roads that reach to the very bowels of the earth. There are great worms' holes and giants' beds, and there are other skies, ruled by powers apart from our sun and moon and stars. And he, Thomas, he was barely across the skirting stones of this land, when he broke through the mist onto the shore of a thunderous and fast-moving river, whose waters ran as thick and as dark as wine. The Queen glanced down at him from her mount, as the horse rested one of its hoofen feet in the water. "Go ahead of me you must, Thomas," she said, "and ford the waters that divide thee from thine." Now Thomas said, "I had no choice, and so I stepped into the wine-dark water, and I waded in, until the rushing stream came up to my knees, and my feet brushed over the slick stones of the river bottom. And I closed my eyes, and I prayed to God that those waters would not sweep me away. And so Thomas came at last to stand, weary-stricken, upon the bank. A shadow fell across him, and he glanced up, to find the Queen and her horse standing behind him. She radiated a deep calm, and though a wild beauty had not abated in the slightest, her presence felt to Thomas more tangible, her radiance less searing. "There," Thomas said. "The Queen, she met my eyes, and she reached out her hands toward me. She said, 'Come, Thomas, the journey between here and the ocean's depth is but a stone's throw.' And I took her hand, and in one smooth motion the elfin queen drew Thomas up behind her into the saddle, and she took the reins and she ascended the river's high bank to where they could look down upon the elf queen's realm. They stood upon the verge for a full moment's breath before she urged the horse forward, carrying Thomas away from his own world, down into a stranger land, under a stranger sky, filled with stranger things. Then she turned about her milk-white steed and took me up beside, and flying faster than the wind we left this living land behind. But said she this, 'Thomas, you must hold your tongue, whatever you may hear or see, for speak you a word of elfin land, and Middle-earth you'll never more see.'"
Welcome to the show, to all of our listeners, the first Lore and Legend. This is the part of the show where we have a discussion about the folklore behind the story that we've told and why we like the story and what kind of decisions we made when we put it together and how to tell it and that kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
I'm Rick Scott.
And I'm Sebastian Odell.
To introduce myself, I'm an artist and an illustrator, and I was a history student at the University of Sheffield. I did a PhD in the sort of the philosophy and the history of dreams, specifically in the 17th century, but kind of looking at their whole history in the ancient and medieval world before that as well. And while I was doing that, I kind of discovered the world of storytelling. There was a seminar led by quite a well-known storyteller in the storytelling world, Simon Hayward, who was talking about his work on Irish myths and how he adapted them for performance. And I didn't know that storytelling was this living performance tradition here in Britain, and it was a bit of a revelation. Having discovered this, I went along to Tim Ralph's Storyforge in Sheffield, discovered that there were storytelling festivals, went to Festival at the Edge, and that's how I got started telling stories.
It's a good place for me to come in because that's where I met you. Yeah, so I've been going to the Storyforge for, it must have been since I came to Sheffield, so about 3 years. Before that, I did a little bit of reading stories aloud, off the page, but not in a performative way.
Performing to an audience as a storyteller was something really that I only had contact with once I came here.
Before this, what I did really was I wrote stories, and then sometimes I'd read aloud my own stories, and sometimes I'd read aloud other people's stories.
The stories that we're telling and the way that we're telling them is inspired by the world of storytelling. At storytelling clubs, people tell stories, they don't read them. We're kind of in a halfway house here because although we would have loved to have done a podcast where everything that we did was pure oral storytelling in that mold, just the time constraints and the ambitions that we had for the stories themselves mean that we do use texts, but
it's written for performance, and it's not written for reading.
And certainly the material that we do in this podcast, we will perform at storytelling clubs. And one of the things that we hope is that our experience as storytellers will bring a certain quality to the performance of these stories. We hope you can tell the difference being interested in history. I don't know, as listeners to the podcast, you may be more or less familiar with folklore and mythology. One of the things that appeals to me is discovering myths and folklore. When you think of fairy tales, everybody knows the sort of the canon of the Grimms, Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella. It sort of just barely scratches the surface.
It's funny, in terms of there being lots and lots of stuff out there, there are also lots of different versions. This morning I was walking with a friend, and she was telling me about a story that she'd heard somebody tell her. And I realised as she was telling that story that I knew the story, but as a song about a different character, such that I was able to predict the next bit of her story from knowing the next verse to the song, which was really interesting because that meant that there was a story that probably went through another version of that story that then got made into a song. That is the great thing about the oral tradition. Somebody will have picked it up some 300 years ago and reworked it in a little way, or made it more relevant to their audience or their experience.
Poets, might say to, well, why do you want to go to folk clubs and hear the same tales being told over and over again? And the answer to that is that, again, there's just so much of it that you don't hear the same things over and over again. Or, well, you do. But even when you hear people tell similar stories or retell the same stories, part of the art of storytelling is putting your own mark on it, doing it your own way, your own performance. And in a way, it really emphasizes the idea that actually recycling material in clever and new ways is very much a part of human culture. And, people, when you think about films and things and people saying like, oh, why can't they just write something new? Why are they rebooting stuff all the time, as if that's sort of evidence of a degeneration of our culture? I tend to look at that and think, well, actually, if you look at all of human culture and human history, people are rebooting things all the time. People remake and retell things all the time, and actually that's exactly how it works.
It helps in many ways when telling a story to have things that people can use as touchstones. Things will sort of draw up echoes in their experience, stories that they're familiar with, because that does have the effect of making something feel quite timeless in a way. It brings them back to something that feels like it's always been there.
Having said that, what's inspiring about the mythology and the folklore for me is that a lot of it is quite new and fresh, especially if you haven't come up against it before. That, we've decided to focus on a series of tales which tackles the other worlds, the strange lands, the fairy folk, but at the same time kind of focuses in on a particular cast of characters which I was certainly not familiar with. This pantheon of elf lords and elf knights.
Yes.
The rulers of the other world.
Our elfin characters are less going to remind you of helpful elves that populate Rivendell, and more, in fact, going to remind you of Sauron and dark creatures like that.
Idea of using this as our framing tale was yours, so what was it that made you pick out Thomas the Rhymer?
Thomas is an attractive character, and it's a very interesting narrative and idea. Thomas is a folk prophet who kind of exists in a medieval romance that gets translated into popular ballads that are sung sort of much later on, sort of in the 16th and 17th centuries, I think. There are a number of prophecies that are sort of attributed to him and have become part of sort of folklore and folk legend. A well-known character in Scottish folklore who kept coming up.
So there's a connection here then between a historical individual and sort of England's historical past and the prophecy of things that then took place through recorded history, and the kind of hidden world behind the world that Thomas's gift is purported to have come from. The kind of
Yes, there's a relationship between the tale of Thomas and his prophetic power, and that makes him an ideal chorus for our series.
I mean, it's the bardic character, isn't it? The idea of story as a revealer of truth.
Yeah.
Storytelling and music as the bearer of magic and tradition and myth and legend. It unlocks that world.
Yes. So the art of storytelling comes to be associated with the magic of the other world that is being described. The storyteller is almost given the gifts of the land's magic, as it were, to bring it to everyone else.
Yeah. The story is in itself, it's weaving the magic, weaving the power, and, the gift is given to the storyteller, and the storyteller gives the gift of the story to you. And so it's good as well that, we've taken this character of Thomas the Rhymer and something that some of our stories are based on or also exist as folk tales or ballads. So we've got verses in there, and that's a storytelling technique that's sometimes called canto fable, where you mix up like telling a story with bits of verse and song.
Yeah.
We're not going to try and sing any of it because that's not a talent that either of us have. But if you do, then come and work with us. So as you listen to the stories, when the verses are invoked, in those moments, that's when Thomas the Rhymer is reciting to his audience at the Tower in Scotland.
The tale of Thomas is serving for us what is known as a framing tale. Listeners, probably the best example, the most well-known example will be the Arabian Nights. The Sultan likes to sleep with a virgin and then cut off the head in the morning. But Scheherazade forestalls this by telling him 1001 Tales?
it's supposed to be, yeah.
So yes, we've kind of adapted the tale of Thomas the Rhymer so that he's our chorus. He's going to be our guide into the mysterious realms of the elfin lands, the elfin queen. The elements of that tale are going to be drawn from the medieval poem, the romance, and also the ballads that are sung about Thomas.
So the format almost of the series is that Thomas has been abducted away to Elfland by the Elfin Queen, and as they move through Elfland, the Queen will tell stories to Thomas. So each week you'll hear a new story from English folklore about the Elflands. We've constructed the framing tale. We have somebody who is at the Tower of listening to Thomas the Rhymer sing a song about his meeting with the Queen of Elfland.
Who is the one telling the story.
Yeah. So, it really does get that convoluted in a lot of these things. I don't know if you've read the 1001 Nights recently, but you'll be inside one story and somebody will stop to tell a story, and somebody in that story will stop to tell a story. It's not going to get that confusing in this podcast, we promise.
If only we had that kind of time.
If only you had that kind of time. It's a nice device, it's fun, and it gives us lots of opportunities for all our tricksy stuff.
I thought it was interesting because you made mention of the Queen is going to show him the sort of real Britain, as though he knows a sort of shadowy, flimsy veneer of the real Britain, which is sort of
wilder and more kind of sinister than he would expect. I particularly like the reference to other skies ruled by other powers that are around sun and moon, which is actually one of my favourite pieces of imagery about the other world, because it's almost always, it's not always, but quite frequently they go underground. They go into barrows or caves, and yet the light is shining there. Not like an artificial light or the light of a candle, but the light like the sun. And it gives this kind of sort of strange kind of like sense of being turned upside down. You've walked into the underground and there the sun is shining, but it's not our sun. And that gives you this, it's a very simple device, but for me it gives this kind of sense of an entirely different world and entirely different powers that you're not used to. So I was very keen on that in the
Yes, well, the meeting with the Queen takes place in this liminal space. There are lots of different elements to that. Eildon Hill is a perfect kind of location for this tale because they are volcanic hills, which might in fact be a formation called a laccolith. Explosions of rock deep underneath the Earth's surface, subsequently raised to break the crust. They are from underground. There are sort of ancient settlements there. Eildon itself is an old Welsh name for an old fort, and there was a Roman signalling station there. Eildon was believed to be one of these hollow hills, the places where you might gain entrance to this other kingdom.
In quite a lot of stories involving the other folk, the meetings with them do occur at these kind of threshold places. In Welsh mythology, it's common to have them occur at a crossroads. Very frequently you get the crossing of water, so going over rivers and across the sea allows you to enter the kingdom of Fairy, but you also get liminal times. So certain times of the year, the boundary between the other world and our world becomes easier to cross, more permeable. So in Irish mythology, you get Beltane and Samhain, which is spring and autumn festivals. I think in Old English myth you get New Year's is a particular time, and the solstices, of course. So there are certain times of year and certain places where where there's not such a solid boundary.
Yes, and all of those things are present in Thomas de Ruymer's tale. So he strays around the woods on the first days of May.
Yeah.
He falls asleep under a tree, falling asleep and waking up into one of these journeys.
Yeah.
It recurs in quite a few sort of poems and tales. Sometimes it's a suggestion that it's a dream, sometimes it's not mentioned, but somebody falls asleep and that's where it all starts. There are certain trees which are also thought to mark the boundary between these worlds. And so the tree on Eildon Hill, which is a hollow hill, there was a lot of sources say that it's a hawthorn tree. But I actually found a blog post by a researcher called Lee Ray, who talks about this, and he says that it's probably not a hawthorn tree. In fact, it's more likely to be an elder tree. And that's sort of also the reason why, in my telling of the tale, one of the commenters on this post said there's an association as well between elder trees and elder wine having magical properties. Appropriate also because Thomas seems to possibly be a bit of a drunkard as well, a bit of a wastrel.
He likes the taste of elderberry wine.
Yes. So then and then they go under the tree into the hollow hill, and then they cross a river. They cross the water boundary.
Yes.
So almost every single one of those markers of liminality exist either in the romance or in the ballads. They are all woven together here.
One of the pieces of description I really liked was the Queen's smile as wolfish, having something with a wolf about it, which really quite plays up the sort of element of the fairy queen as this a kind of seductress character whose beauty has enchanted Thomas, and then she even tells him that he's playing with fire by kissing her, but he can't resist and is therefore sort of brought under her sway, which is quite a common theme, sort of uncontrollable desire as a starting point.
Fatal attraction.
Yeah,
I mean that's the essence in some ways, isn't it, of enchantment. Beauty that is beguiling but also deadly.
Beguiling, that's the word. As an addendum to the earlier discussion, the thing about Thomas being sort of the chorus to repeat through our stories, you have this story of Thomas the Rhymer, but all of the action in the actual story is carried out by the Elf Queen. Thomas is a sort of hapless participant, but who's sort of dragged along by the caprices of fate.
Yes, in a way, it's almost the Queen is our guide, but the Queen is Thomas's guide, and then Thomas is letting us into the story. And there may be consequences to that, as we will see.
Yeah, he's
there's a transformation suggested that we're going to maybe see that process. The Thomas who starts out on this journey doesn't seem to be the kind of legendary personage that we're introduced to at the start of the story, does it?
Yes, that's true. We by the time you jump to him in the forest, he's now a drunkard, a reprobate, as opposed to some sort of legendary folkloric figure.
So contact with the other world will change you.
Yes. The powerful and sometimes costly gifts that it brings are a force for change in people's stories is one of the things. You have the thing of in the kind of hero's journey. Before embarking on their quest, the hero receives supernatural aid, and the accomplishment of whatever quest within the unknown, with the help of whatever these gifts are, is the thing that moves their plot, their story in a sort of personal sense.
Always got to get a bit of Campbell in there.
I was going to say, we can't claim to be a serious podcast of folklore if we're not going to discuss the hero's journey. Thomas's journey will continue next week, when the Elfin Queen unfolds for him the fearful tale of the Curse of Pantanus. You've been listening to Lore and Legend, Episode 1, The Rhymer's Tale. Our story today was interpreted and performed by Rick Scott. Music in this episode was performed by Robert Bentall. For news about upcoming episodes and more info about our stories and their sources in world folklore, find us at www.loreandlegend.co.uk or follow us on Facebook and Twitter @ofloreandlegend. If you like what you hear and you want to hear more, there are a number of ways that you can support us here at Lore and Legend. We're committed to keeping the episodes in this series free of adverts, but if you choose to listen to Lore and Legend through the Radio Public app, Listening to a few short sponsor messages between episodes will generate some modest sponsorship money for us. You can download Radio Public for free on the Android or Apple Store. If you don't want to listen to any ads, please consider supporting the podcast through our creators page on Patreon at www.patreon.com/lore-and-legend. Financial support motivates us to keep on telling our stories, and may allow us to develop more creative content for our listeners in future. If you can't afford to support us regularly, but want to drop a few coins in the hat, you can do so using our PayPal link at paypal.me/lore-and-legend.